So what I thought I'd do as part 3 of my review of the JX-8P is to go over common issues with this synth. And it's quite interesting that there is quite a lot of information about issues that have presented themselves with this 35-year-old synth that I've been lent by Richard. These are the sort of common issues, especially for something that is an early model, which would be 35 years old. And I thought I'd go through a number of these. But before we continue, I thought I'd be really upfront here. This is not my synthesizer, and therefore I am not going to open it up. This is Richard's synthesizer, and I think it's unfair if I opened it up and I did some damage to it. That would be wrong. So I'm not going to open the synthesizer up. I'm just going to point out the issues that have been pointed out to me, either through friends who've owned one of these things in the past, or the research that I've done on YouTube in putting together some of the videos that I've been doing. So let's carry on. Okay, this is the part of the video where we do the channel self-promotion. Very important part of the video, I might add. But we must observe the normal parish notices, which are, if you haven't subscribed to the channel and you like videos about this sort of thing or these sort of things, you need to hit the subscribe button. If you want to be notified when videos hit the channel, save yourself some time, hit the bell icon at the same point. If you're watch the video and you like what you see, please give the video a thumbs up. It helps with the YouTube algorithm. The more thumbs up, the more people get to see what you have obviously enjoyed. Also down there, please leave comments. I read them all, I respond to them all, and sometimes they even generate ideas for future videos. Down there is the address of the TMTG community. For less than the price of a cup of coffee, which is an utter bargain, you can keep this channel rocking and rolling and help the production of videos in the future. And finally, Instagram and Facebook feeds. I know many of you have started to DM me on those two platforms. Please continue. Pop over to Instagram and Facebook. Hook me up there or tag me or whatever it is nowadays we will say about Instagram and Facebook, and you'll see all the channel notices and normal promotions that don't make it to YouTube. But now back to this particular video. Now, nearly everybody I've spoken to about this synth has said, watch the power board. And it seems to be that the power board is really quite an Achilles heel of this particular synthesizer. What they basically told me was it was originally underspecified for the synth, and the key issue is around the 5-volt circuit that overheats and burns out. And a number of people have said this: the 5-volt circuit needs to be upgraded, and basically the issue is around how it regulates 5 volts. So I'm not going to go into the whys and wherefores of how a DC to AC conversion works, because if you're savvy enough to take this to pieces and get in there to start looking at the power board, you have some sort of idea of how you get from an AC to a DC circuit. Anyway, the issue is around the bridge rectifier that sits on the 5-volt circuit, and I think, and I can't remember whether it's rated at 1 amp or rated at 1.5 amps, and you probably would sit there and think, actually that's enough. The problem is that it is actually underspecified, and it heats up through use. It gets very, very hot, which then causes the voltage regulator that sits on that 5-volt circuit to have to work hard as well. And the combination of the two working hard is that the voltage regulator gets hot and the bridge rectifier gets hot. In fact, people have actually told me that if you have this thing on and running for a period of time, and then you were to switch it off and then try to put your finger on top of the bridge rectifier, you probably would burn your finger, because that's how hot it runs. And also, you know, if you've got, when you switch it off again and you've had it running for a while, and there's a big aluminium heatsink that runs along the back of the power board, which is where the voltage regulators are tacked onto for heat dissipation, obviously. And they said, you know, it's noticeably that it's warm anyway, but the end where the 12-volt voltage regulator is very warm, and it grades down to the other end of the. So basically, I think if I remember correctly from the photographs I've seen, the 5-volt is on the right-hand side as you look at it, and the other 12-volt is on the other side. And they said you can see the noticeable difference between the two. But what they've said is the recommendation here is, if you acquire one of these things, is to get straight in there, get onto the power board and swap out the voltage regulator for at least a 2 amp, if not a 3 amp. And the modern specification, you can buy a voltage regulator with a very similar specification of what's in here, but rated at 3 amps. And the other thing about buying a more modern voltage regulator is you can buy a voltage regulator that has, sorry, not a voltage regulator, a bridge rectifier that has a facility to actually have a heat sink put on top of it. So you can actually put some conductive paste and then attach a heat sink directly to the bridge rectifier. That helps dissipate quite a lot of heat, apparently. The second thing they've said is you should probably recap the power board capacitors, even if they don't look like they're going. Especially if you've got an early model that's never been done. These things are 35 years old. It's probably a good piece of maintenance just to recap those capacitors. There's only a few of them there, so it's not a massive job. And the third thing a couple of people have said to me is, if the voltage regulator has been working extremely hard because the bridge rectifier is underspecified, they've said it's probably likely to go, and they, as a precaution, have dropped a new voltage regulator in there as well. So effectively the whole of the 5-volt circuit has been refreshed, and they said they've seen considerably less heat generated by doing those 3 pieces of work. So that's the first thing. Power board is the Achilles heel. The next one is, I found this quite amusing when somebody told me, but I've now heard it a couple of times actually, and they call it the keyboard dust bunnies. Now, the keyboard on this, if you play the keyboard, you can feel it's actually quite springy. Well, this one is anyway, and that's because actually underneath the keyboard is a mechanical contact mechanism, not the rubber contacts that you see on a lot of the later synths that came from various different keyboard manufacturers. So this is actually a mechanical contact system, and what a number of people have said is that the issue is that dust obviously falls down between the keys, and any other foreign objects, liquids, etc., fall down between the keys, and they can get into this mechanical mechanism. Now, what a number of people have said to me is it's probably recommended that you strip out the keyboard and at a minimum just get some compressed air and blow through the mechanical contacts, just to get rid of the keyboard dust bunnies, as they put it to me. Which I found quite amusing. I'm going to use that phrase quite a lot. But that will just get rid of any dust that's sort of sitting around that area and just clean that up. That was the first thing they said to me. The second thing is that when you actually take the keyboard out, is to look and see if you can see any ingress of liquids, because a lot of these things were gigged. Let's be faced. I mean, you know, it's either in the studio or it's being gigged, this sort of synthesizer. Now it's sort of turning up in people's home collections, but back in the day, these things were gigged. And you know, going through the keyboard were all kinds of nasties, from just water to beer and coke and many other nasties that do damage. So what they've said is, look, you know, you should really, if you've got the time, strip down the key bed, clean the keys in warm soapy water, just to get rid of any deposits that are on the keys that might make them stick. This mechanism, I've been all the way up and down this keyboard. This keyboard is actually really, really nice, but other keyboards may not be so. So they first of all said, clean the keys, warm soapy water, you'll feel much, much better about that. The second thing is there is a metal shelf that runs underneath this. The keys sit on that metal shelf. And when you strip the keys out, you should be able to inspect the metal shelf and see if it's got signs of rust, which would show liquid ingress, for argument's sake. And you can then treat that metal shelf based on the level of damage on the metal shelf. And they said the problem you have is if you don't treat that metal shelf, the rust will start to flake, and then you get bits of rust in the contacts, and then it becomes a much bigger issue. So what they've said is strip the keyboard down. They've said that cleaning the keyboard is a lengthy process, but ultimately it's a rewarding process because it really extends the life of the keyboard and the keybed, that you don't then have to go and start trying to source spares for. So that's number 2, the keyboard and keybed. Okay, number 3, potentiometers. And I've said before, there aren't very many sliders and knobs on this particular keyboard, which all hails from the fact that sort of the control is digital, but the actual waveform generation is analog. Anyway, you do have a bank of faders over here, and I'll put a picture up over there somewhere so you can see these. And again, what a number of people have said is these faders are quite important, especially this edit fader, because that does a lot of data entry on the keyboard. And what they've basically said is that these faders were manufactured by Panasonic and have long since been discontinued. And what makes them unique is they are actually what somebody described to me as a stereo fader, which basically means they have 2 tracks inside the fader itself that control. If it's a volume, it's controlling the left and right channel. If it's data entry, it could be 2 different sorts of data entry. And somebody said, well, they're unique. Well, they're not really unique because you get stereo faders all over the place. They're probably unique in the way they've been implemented in this particular keyboard, though. Anyway, that's the faders. The issue really comes from age, abuse, and storage. Age is obvious, early models will be 35 years old. Abuse, you have no idea how this keyboard has been treated in the past. Now, if I'm looking at this particular keyboard, there's a number of sort of little dinks on this membrane here, and there's obviously some wear down the left-hand side. So it's had a life. But you don't know how heavy a life this thing has had before you've acquired it. So you've got to bear that in mind, so that whoever has had this in the past will be, I don't know, moving faders up and down on a regular basis. And the last thing, and this is probably more interesting, is storage. Now, between the faders and the circuit board that sits underneath, what Roland did in this keyboard is they put effectively a foam insert in there with cutouts that the faders poked through. The idea of this was very simple, was to catch rubbish that dropped down into the fader track but didn't actually drop down onto the fader itself. It sort of dropped at the foam. The foam was designed to catch that rubbish and hopefully stop it getting down into the fader. Now, the issue with that is that type of foam is prone to damp and humidity. So if there's been any moisture where this keyboard has been, then that foam will start to degrade. And you know how that foam degrades. It sort of starts to effectively flake away, which actually causes more problems if you think about it, because if it starts to flake away, then that drops into the fader and causes issues. So that's kind of the first thing. The other thing is if things have been poured into it, that foam will obviously have got wet. And if it hasn't been taken out and properly dried, then again, that will cause it to start to decay. The other thing about the foam is if it's disintegrated, then a previous owner might have actually taken it out to stop it, or as they thought, to stop it going through, and not replaced it with another piece of foam. The foam sponge that's used is not uncommon. It's fairly common stuff. You see it in keyboard cases and what have you. The issue with today's modern foam is it's far more resilient than the sort of stuff that was put into this keyboard in 1986 to 89. So if you want to replace it now, you get something that's a lot better, and it will actually protect dust dropping down. However, if dust has dropped down into the potentiometers, then it's probably a good practice when you acquire this keyboard to give each one of those a good clean. So that's pot or slider spray into there, work it in and see if that helps. And then remember, you know, if you're going to do that, especially if you're going to actually start opening the pots up or the sliders up, you need to get some grease, because otherwise those tracks will then have direct contact and friction, and they won't last very long. So anyway, that's a side point. Now, the good news is, if you have to replace a slider, you can get modern equivalents that on paper look the same. They have the same pin configuration, the same specs in terms of track resistance, etc. Okay, and you look at that and you say, okay, I can replace that. It's a direct replacement. It is not a direct replacement. The pin configuration on these Panasonic faders is not the same as the pin configuration of some of the modern equivalents. So just be careful when you're actually replacing these, that you don't actually have to do something like a jump lead from one pin to another part of the board, because the pin that you were soldering into the socket is not doing the same as the pin that came out of that socket, if that makes sense. So a couple of people have said, if you do need to change them, you can change them, but you might have to do a little bit of pin reconfiguration with some jumper leads, because the pins are not in the same position electronically, even though they might be physically. I'm hoping that this video has been useful to you. If it was, give it a thumbs up, and it will hopefully give you some pointers about some of the things that might go wrong with your purchase of your JX-8P. And on that note, I will leave you with my normal greeting, which is live long and prosper, and I'll see you on the next one.